US and Iran has wiped out investor wealth worth 3 lakh crore rupees in a span of just 3 hours on Dalal Street today. The Sensex fell almost 800 points and the Nifty gave up its 12K mark, with all sectoral indices ending the day in red. Crude prices are also on the boil, with Brent breaching its $70 per barrel mark. So what is going on in the Indian markets, and how long will this fear of the strife between Iran and the US continue? To get more perspective, I'm joined now by Nikunj Dalmia, Managing Editor, ET Now. Nikunj, scary day in the markets?
Well, crude going higher is not bad news, but it's very bad news. It's not very bad news, it is very, very bad news. Crude prices going higher have a direct correlation to our economy, which is that direct and immediate impact on our economy. That's one. B, Indian markets have had a good year-end close also. November was good, December was great. Markets were looking elevated and they were looking for a reason to correct. But the problem with the current flare-up in the crude is that it is coming at a time when there was a glimmer of a hope that the economy had bottomed out. There was a view that the inflation will remain low and the monetary policy would be at work. So the entire theorem or the thesis, Tamanna, what markets were working with, a reset button has been pressed. Now you can argue back and say, look, this is geopolitical tension, it may not be permanent, and I hope it's not permanent, because if this is permanent, then we could be staring at much more downside and some more weakness in the market.
You know, but so for India, the direct impact is minimal, in the sense we have the crude impact, of course, but the way things look like they could escalate, India will take some time before it finds itself bearing the brunt. Is it the only thing bothering markets right now, or are they waiting to see what happens next?
See, markets, let me put it this way. Indian markets were due for a correction, and sometimes when you're due for a correction, you will find an excuse, a reason, or an event really to correct. Now, this is a big global event. It's not like any reset has happened. Global economy has seen crude shocks in the past. Middle East crisis is something which modern investors, they know how to deal with them. So it's not like end of the game or this is going to be a reboot button. The challenge is that this is coming at a time when the Indian economy was supposed to be bottoming out. Now, if you are an outsider, you would say, why should I be in a hurry to invest in India? What is that Indian economy of stock markets are offering me? Yeah. Economy which is contracting, earnings which are not picking up, valuation which are sky high, and a macro which is about to deteriorate. So when you put these four factors together, the desire to buy the fall is not going to be there. So my sense is that Indian markets were due for a correction. They're using this event to correct. Will they correct further if crude does not settle down? Yes. After 15-20 days, we'll start talking about earnings and budget. But for the moment, the narrative has got very sour.
Perfect storm of exactly. All of these factors. Thank you so much, Nikunj, for that perspective. And now let's get an idea of the geopolitical implications of what we have been seeing over the last few days. Joining me now are Dr. Kanwal Sibal, former diplomat and former Foreign Secretary, Sushant Sareen, Strategic Affairs Analyst and Senior Fellow ORF, and Alistair Newton, co-founder and director of Alavan Business Advisory. Welcome to all of you, and thank you for speaking with us today. Alistair, let me get your perspective. Now, I was chatting with Nikunj a little earlier on the India impact, so let me start with that. How scary is this for us sitting in India? And I know it's scary for the whole world right now, and not just from how expensive crude may get, but this could seriously blow up.
It could, and let me start by saying I do agree with Nikunj that from the perspective of India, massive net importer of oil, it's not at all surprising that we've seen the sell-off in the Indian equity markets, which we've seen today, quite irrespective of whether a correction was actually due or not. I happen to agree with him about that, but let's put that to one side. Nevertheless, I do think it is important to keep what has happened to date in proportion. If we consider the increase we saw in the price of Brent on Friday, immediately after the news broke, we saw roughly 3.5%. We've seen another 2% or so today. So we're looking at a cumulative increase in the price of Brent of around about 6%. Now, let's consider that against what happened after the strike against Saudi Aramco on the 14th of September, when we saw an increase in the price of Brent to roughly the level it is today, i.e. just over $70 a barrel, but that was a 20% increase. So I would have to start by saying I think that markets have actually reacted in a fairly measured manner to events so far since last Thursday and the assassination actually took place. Now, there's clearly a reason for this. At present, there is no clear direct threat to oil supply. It could be that downstream we are going to see oil supply negatively affected by the reverberations which follow from what we saw last week. But so far, there is no clear direct threat to oil supply emerging. And it could be that if things stay like this for a little while, and they may, it's not clear what Iran will do by way of retaliation, that we actually see the price of Brent crude easing again. Nevertheless, for the moment, I think the market action we've seen, both in terms of oil price and in terms of buying gold and in terms of equities, is perfectly reasonable and rational, and that what we are going to see going forward is probably a protracted period of uncertainty and a certain amount of volatility being driven during that period, not only by events, but also by rhetoric emanating from both Tehran and Washington.
A lot of rhetoric today from U.S. President Donald Trump as well, putting out a series of tweets since the last couple of hours. One of them quite randomly saying that Iran will never have a nuclear weapon, and then talking a lot about impeachment. I want to get a perspective, and let's not just focus on what happens to crude prices, because Kaval Sibal, let me start with you. Just let's take a look at the pictures coming out today from Tehran at the funeral of the assassinated Iranian leader Qasem Soleimani, and thousands and lakhs of people there thronging the streets. They are promising retaliation. How much should we be worried right now? And forget about the hashtags of World War III. How do you assess the situation as it's developing?
I think it is worrisome. Iran will be under great pressure to take some retaliatory action. Their options are limited because their economy is in trouble as it is. They need European support, which they can only maintain if they don't escalate the situation to a point where Europe finds that its hands are tied and can no longer support Iran. They have announced that they will walk out of the JCPOA. I think that would worry Russia and China, because all these powers were involved in this JCPOA. And certainly Russia, from my own experience, I know, would not favor a nuclearized Iran because of its repercussions on the larger region. They are very dependent on oil supplies themselves because their oil exports have dwindled drastically, but they need revenue from whatever oil they are able to export. China is buying oil from them, and therefore it will not be in their interest to obstruct the flow of oil in the Persian Gulf to the extent that their own interests are severely damaged. Now, there could be some action against Israel through the Hezbollah. There could be some attack in Saudi Arabia directly or through, not directly, but through Yemen. There could be, as what happened in the case of Aramco, they may do something there. It's possible. They have shown their ability to do so, but there are risks downside of doing this for them. Also, certainly there will be some attack on American bases and American personnel in this larger area that can be expected. The long and short is, while the Iranian options are limited, they would be under tremendous pressure to do something to assuage public opinion and also their pride, and also in terms of preserving their sovereignty. One thing that has happened is where the Iraqi parliament has now passed a resolution asking all US forces to leave Iraq. Now, this is a non-binding resolution, but if the executive takes the further step of asking the US troops to leave Iraq totally, that would also be a severe damage to American interests in the region. But they will maintain their presence in Syria, and from there they can take action, whatever they need to do in terms of the Islamic State or whatever their game plan is. So the long and short in answer to your question is that something is bound to happen. And this is not good for us. In fact, we have become a bit of a hostage to American actions and now the potential escalation of the situation by Iran. I personally think that the action by President Trump was totally in violation of international law. It was an act of war. It cannot be supported. But there is nothing that we can do because they have taken this action irrespective of its impact on its strategic ally like India. Now, we have interest in Iran, but we have no control over Iran's reaction. They may take some action and we will suffer because our 80% of our crude is imported, so the rise in oil prices affects us. Iraq is the largest supplier of oil, and if that gets disrupted, we are in trouble. We have remittances coming from the region. We have 7-8 million people. So in fact, we are going to be very negatively affected if the situation escalates and if these tensions come to a boiling point.
One interesting point you made, Mr. Sibil, and let me get Sushant to respond on that, Trump has acted, you're saying it's an act of war, and without thinking about what India wants, I doubt he cares what anyone really thinks. Now, Sushant, is it foregone that there will be some kind of retaliation from Iran, from the kind of statements that have been made? And if so, what could they be?
Not necessary, because there have been instances in the past. For example, 1998, when the Taliban killed, and Taliban was not America, right? It was a ragtag bunch of medieval warriors, and they captured Mazar-e-Sharif and killed 11 Iranian diplomats. The Iranians went into the same kind of furious mode which we are seeing today play out in Iran, and they threatened to bring down the wrath of God on the Taliban. And finally, after a couple of weeks, nothing happened. So it's not necessary that they will react. But yes, I agree that with Soleimani being the kind of figure he was, there would be tremendous pressure on the Iranians. But the point is that what will they do what they haven't done already without provoking a larger war? Let's also keep in mind the fact that if they are pulled out, if the Iraqis send the Americans packing from Iraq, please don't forget that it's all very well to say that the Shiite militias did everything against the Islamic State, but that would not have been possible unless they had the American support and the American backing and the American war effort, which also was working in tandem with them. On their own, I have serious doubts what the Shiite militias could achieve against the Islamic State. So I don't think it's in Iraq's interest also to get rid of the Americans just yet. So probably this shadow boxing will take place among all these countries. But the bottom line is that for Iran, the problem is going to be, they can attack some oil tanker, they can bring down some drone, something like that. But I don't think they're going to escalate to a point where they enter into that escalation spiral, and which nobody wants. I don't think the Iranians want it for reasons Ambassador Sibbal has just laid out. I don't think the Americans want it. So I think this situation will remain disturbed. I don't think it will settle down. For me, as an Indian, an additional cause of worry, apart from what Sibbal has laid out, is the fact that we have seen the Shias in India also get all hot under the collar for what has happened out there. We've seen in the past that the Iranians have exercised some degree of influence on these guys. Even at the time of the Islamic State, there was an effort to build up some kind of militias out here and send them to Iran. We've seen a terror attack take place in Delhi, in the start of Delhi, allegedly by the Iranians against the Israelis. So we might see something like that happen, and that is an additional cause for worry. But other than that, I think we can issue pious statements. But let us also not forget that to call it a war, call it an act of war. But the Iranians have also provoked this. They have been constantly pushing the envelope. They have been targeting oil facilities, they've been targeting oil tankers, all sorts of things. They've been using the proxies to attack Riyadh. They've been using Hezbollah to attack Israel. They've been using Hamas to do the same thing. So somewhere down the line, somebody had to call their bluff and hit them back. Now, whether
Let
this
me, let
is
me,
the
let me get some responses on that, Sushant. A couple of controversial statements you've made. Well, personally, I don't think any Indians, whether they're Shia or not, should be called out by saying that, they will act against the interests of this country because of their religious beliefs. So I do object to that.
no,
I
you
do
can
object
object
to
to
that.
that reality. There was
Yeah.
an
No,
effort
no,
to
I
make
do
it.
object to that. I think
That
India's
there was
concerns
a
right now is that how do they balance between, their relations, our relations with Iran and with the United States. So we've toed the
Look, one
line.
second.
We've
Just a
toed the
point.
line
Let
as
me
far
just
as
make a point.
sanctions are concerned, and we've
Let-
we've minimally dropped our crude imports. Now, what do we do next? What do we do next, and what is the kind of response we've had so far? Let me just get Mr. Sibul in on some of the points you've made and to respond to that as well. So India has struck a very moderate tone so far, asking everyone to keep peace, keep calm, etc., etc. But will it, remain in a situation where we can stand on the sidelines and then hope things work out?
But there's nothing much we can do. Frankly, we don't have much leverage. We don't have leverage with the United States because if the United States was at all concerned about India's interests or those of its partners elsewhere, they wouldn't have unnecessarily escalated the situation by killing a very powerful military figure of a sovereign state, assassinating him. It's an extrajudicial killing. It's a very serious provocation. Earlier on, proxies, they were using proxies to hurt each other, but this is a direct assault on the Iranian state and it is totally unjustified. And frankly, look, when Trump decided to walk out of the JCPOA, it meant that all doors for a potential negotiation with Iran were being closed. And then look at the kind of sanctions they have imposed. Even on Khamenei himself, on the supreme leader, even on their foreign minister, on their central bank. They have stopped India even from buying oil. It was our third largest supplier of oil, and now our supplies have dwindled to zero. They have squeezed. It's also an act of war where you are wanting to destroy a country economically. Now, what would you expect Iran to do? Whatever asymmetric actions they could take, which Sushant has listed, these were perfectly legitimate in terms of what the United States were doing. They had to react. So I don't think that Iran was provoking anybody. In fact, Iran has been very seriously provoked. And if America and Trump had not decided to repudiate their nuclear deal, things would have got stabilized. And why can't Iran also have regional interests? Why only United States and Israel and others have regional interests? As a country in the region, they are perfectly entitled to protect their regional interests. And if they're under attack day in and day out by United States and Israel, by Bolton and others, and also threatened with military action, what do you expect them to do? They have to take positions on the ground which would actually help them to preserve their security. And the Islamic State was created. God knows who created it. We know who created it. There are suspicions that Saudi Arabia, UAE, even the United States has had a hand in this. And what was the Islamic State intended to do? It was intended to attack, make things very difficult for the Shias in Iraq as well as in Iran. And therefore, they were very much a part of an arrangement between Russia and Iran and Iraq to combat the Islamic State. So, you cannot simply put the blame on one side and excuse the other side.
No,
I think America has acted very irresponsibly.
Yeah.
And Iran is no angel, I agree. Iran is no angel, I agree. But one cannot sort of whitewash the American action and put the blame on
Alistair,
Iran.
do you want to jump into this debate happening over here? Do you want to jump into this debate and how you see, things pan out?
I'd like to look at the other side of the equation. I must say that, first of all, I do agree with a lot of what the other two speakers have said. Not everything, but a lot of it. Certainly,
Each
Iran
other.
is
So
no
which
angel.
parts do you agree with?
Well, I want to go to another angle on this, please, because I want to think about President Trump's motivation here.
Absolutely.
There is one priority and only one top priority for Donald Trump today, and that is winning a second term. And whatever he does between now and the 3rd of November is going to be driven by his assessment of how best to secure a second term of office. And he's going to continue to do things which play strongly to his base. Roughly 35% of his base is made up of white evangelicals who strongly support Israel and are therefore, by default, if nothing else, strongly opposed to Iran. I think the action we saw the US take last week was largely engineered by Secretary of State Michael Pompeo, himself a white evangelical, playing to Donald Trump's election priorities. Now, having said that, what he did does not necessarily make a lot of sense for him in re-election terms, because Donald Trump knows full well that higher gasoline prices at the pump in the US are electorally a very, very sensitive issue in the US. He also knows that American body bags coming back from the Middle East is a very sensitive electoral issue in the US. So he's going to need to play it very carefully indeed, no matter what steps Iran takes next. And there is no doubt, in my view, that to go to one of the things which has been said previously, both parties, both Iran and the US, are culpable to a significant extent in where we are today. Donald Trump walking away from the JCPOA, Iran's regional aspirations, which I would have to concede are driven significantly defensively in the aftermath of the Iran-Iraq war, a war which a lot of people in the West tend to disregard completely. But Iran's regional interests have been driven by its own perception of its own security requirements. And frankly, America has been treading roughshod over those interests since Trump walked away from the JCPOA, which I think was a huge error on behalf of the US in terms of regional stability.
Yeah, I want to take on what you said in the beginning of your comment, Alistair, and let me open up the debate to this as well. What is Trump trying to do? And if you look at what he has tweeted just in the last few hours, and of course there's one tweet on Iran never having nuclear weapons, but then he goes on to talk about the impeachment quote-unquote hoax. Is that what is really bothering him? Sushant, your perspective of the timing, because they can, I'm sure you and Mr. Sibal can, argue till kingdom come about who's right and whether it was right. But this man wants to win a re-election. He wants the heat off him as far as the impeachment process is concerned. Is this a distraction, a classic political play?
Look, you can attribute whatever baser motives you want to, and very often when this kind of an action is taken. So, for example, when a Pulwama happened and Prime Minister Modi reacted with the Balakot attack, his detractors insisted that he did this only because there was an election coming. He did it only for electoral reasons. But many of those detractors did not understand where Mr. Modi was coming from. Mr. Modi was always of this view that he is not going to take this kind of proxy warfare or this kind of, using of all sorts of other nefarious activities by Pakistan lying down. And he's going to hit back. Now, you could link it up with the elections, but he did it not because of the election.
If I can just interrupt for a second, the example you're giving is not a clear parallel because India responded to an attack. Here, there was some kind of information that Trump claims he has.
Tamanna, you seem to be forgetting that the immediate provocation for taking out Soleimani was the attack on US embassy. It was clearly an orchestrated attack. It was clearly orchestrated. The very fact that the guy who kind of stormed the US embassy the leader of that was killed by Soleimani. And for that, Soleimani.
Okay. I'm going to have to fix your line, Sushant. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to fix your line. Let me just come to Mr. Sibal before that while I try and get a clearer line with you. Mr. Sibal, just on the point that Alistair was making about where this goes and why the context of that is important, because if part of this motivation is to win a re-election, and we're talking about Donald Trump here, how far could he go?
I think he is in a difficult situation. They must have worked it out. They are not fools. They must have worked it out because on the one hand, his electorate expects him to bring the boys back home, and this was his election slogan. He's been threatening to walk out of Iraq or Syria and from Afghanistan. And why was he doing that? Again, as was said earlier in a different context, this was in response to what his base wants. And now if he gets embroiled in a conflict with a new conflict in the Middle East, this time with Iran, this will go directly against his promises to his electorate, and he could have a difficult time justifying what he is doing, because this has been arbitrarily provoked by him. The point that was made earlier that some local militia tied to the Iranians attacked some US military base and killed one contractor. He was not even a military personnel, he was a contractor. And then the Americans reacted. They killed 25 of these fellows. And the matter should have ended there. Where was the need then to kill the general, assassinate the general?
If I can hear Sushant.
I think Trump,
Sushant,
to
quick
my
response.
mind, he
No,
made
it
a
wasn't.
mistake. He's made a mistake.
It wasn't so much. It wasn't only about the attack on the US base and killing of a contractor. I think it was also about the storming of the US embassy. How can you forget that? And it was stormed by the very people whose head was with Soleimani when he was killed. And Soleimani was seen to have been the person who orchestrated that. And what can be a graver provocation than storming of embassy?
Okay, but why now? Why now? What next? I've run out of time. I'm going to have to take a very quick break. But why now? What next? What happens, if this blows up to the world and to India? These are questions that are going to keep us on edge for the next few days. Let's hope it blows over and doesn't escalate. But meanwhile, I want to thank all three of you for joining us on the deep dive this evening as we try and understand the Iran-US standoff and the impact it could have on India. What a start to the new year with huge geopolitical tension hovering around us.